As as we continue on in the Hagaddah, continuing with Ha Lachma Anya, so I wanted to share with you an idea that the Maharal discusses. The Lachma Anya, the poor bread that we're referring to, is of course the matzah. And matzah has a very interesting symbolism in the Hagaddah. On the one hand, in certain places it seems to be a symbol of slavery, because after all it's the poor bread that our ancestors ate in Egypt. At the same time, it seems at other places to be a symbol of freedom. So the Maharal addresses this point, and he explains how is it that Lachma Anya, the poor bread, could at the same time be considered to be a symbol of freedom. And the Maharal says because matzah is made out of two ingredients. It's bread and water and nothing else. If you would add other ingredients to the matzah, it would then be considered to be matzah ashira, which literally is rich matzah, and a person cannot fulfill his obligation with the matzah ashira, the rich matzah. And so he explains why is it that it's a symbol of freedom? Because he says a poor person has nothing encumbering him. He has nothing weighing him down, nothing creating any complications in his life. All he has is himself and nothing else. He says that's the ultimate freedom, not to be weighed down by anything. You know, I recall back when I lived in Los Angeles and I was making the wonderful salary of a school teacher. One day I was talking to a person who was extremely wealthy, and I'm talking about Los Angeles wealthy. And he said to me, "Do you think I have it any better than you?" He says, "Do you realize at the end of every month, I'm struggling to pay my mortgage on his $4 million house, and I'm struggling to pay my car payments, and I'm struggling to pay full tuition for all of my children in private school?" Now, frankly, I didn't feel all that bad for him, but that's the encumbrances that someone who is impoverished doesn't have. So that's how the Maharal describes the reason why matzah, which is the simplest food consisting of nothing else other than flour and water and not encumbered by any other ingredients, that's why the matzah is a symbol of freedom, of a person who isn't weighed down by anything else in his life and just has himself and the freedom to be himself. The Chalban points out that right after we speak about the fact that this is the poor bread, if we then go in and say that anybody who's hungry can come and eat together with us. What's the segue from the poor bread to anybody who's hungry can come and eat with us? So he says that obviously Pesach is the holiday of freedom. And he says if we want to define what is true freedom, he says true freedom is when a person has the ability to be true to himself, to his essence, and to his deepest will. He says that you could have a person who doesn't have any difficult taskmaster over himself, making his life miserable. That doesn't necessarily mean that the person is truly free. He says there can be all sorts of things going on in the person's life which are taking himself and his essence and squeezing it down and not allowing him to truly be himself. He says real freedom overcomes all of those burdens in all of their different forms. And when a person has that true freedom, that's when the person can find true joy and true happiness. And he says that the spirit that emanates from Pesach is the spirit to find the ability to overcome all of those factors that are squashing our ability to truly be ourselves. And therefore, on Pesach, when we're celebrating and experiencing that freedom, what really denotes the true freedom of the person's self? How could the person express himself in the truest manner? And that is when we have the ability to give of ourselves to others. Not to just enjoy ourselves alone, but to be able to give of our joy and our fortune to other people. That's when we really have the ability to express our truest selves. And that's why at the very moment when we celebrate leaving slavery and exiting into a state of freedom, the first thing we say is, who's here and with whom can I share my fortune? As I'm saying this, I'm realizing that unfortunately this year is going to be a Pesach when our ability to share our fortune with others is going to be very truncated. Just the other day, I got a message from someone who's been a guest at our home on numerous occasions, asking if they can join us this Shabbos. And very sadly, I had to say that we were not in a position to welcome a guest this Shabbos because of the current situation. So it's really unfortunate, and I guess that we all need to dig deep inside ourselves that if we can't share our fortune with others when it comes to Pesach in the manner that we might do at other times, to try to figure out other ways that we can express that this year under the current circumstance. Moving back now to the Sefer that I quoted from a few times yesterday, the Beis Avram, Beis Aaron, in one of his commentaries called the Agudas Ezov, he points out that the Arizal says that the reason why the generation was subjugated in Egypt was because they were a replication of the souls of the generation of the flood and the generation of the Tower of Bavel and the generation of the people of Sodom, which is essentially a way of saying that somehow the sojourn in Egypt had to atone for the sins of those generations. What was the sin of the people of Sodom? It was the fact that they refused to support people who were impoverished. So he says that's why in Egypt the Jews were forced to eat lechem oni, the bread of poverty, because since those souls in Sodom were not willing to support the poor, therefore to be punished for that, they had to suffer poverty themselves. But we want to show that we are not like that we have turned the corner, and that's why, after mentioning the fact that our ancestors in Egypt were punished by being impoverished because their souls did not support the poor, that's why we say that all those who are hungry can come and eat, because we want to show that we are now supporting the poor, and that's why we say L'Shana Haba, that next year we're going to be in the land of Israel, because by supporting the poor, the merit of that should bring us a redemption. In his commentary, Pe'er Aaron, so the Beis Avram, Beis Aaron says as follows. Towards the end of Ha Lachma Anya, we say, L'Shana Haba'a B'nei Chorin, that next year we should be free people. And he is focused on the word Chorin. And he points out that in Jewish tradition, there are 5 exiles. Mitzrayim, Egypt, Bavel, Babylonia, Madai, which is Media, Yavan, which is the Syrian Greeks, and Edom, which is symbolized by Rome. And each one of these exiles had a different person who stood at the forefront in order to bring about the redemption. When we left Egypt, the one who stood at the forefront was Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our teacher. When we left Babylonia, the leader was Ezra HaSofer. The exile in Media that we were saved from by Mordechai. The exile at the hands, it was really an internal exile by the Syrian Greeks. We were redeemed from that by Matisyahu Kohen Gadol. And finally, the exile at the hands of Rome, which is the exile that we are still currently experiencing. From that, we will be redeemed by Mashiach. So if you take these 5 leaders who have taken us out of exile, and you keep them more or less in order, but just move Mashiach to the front, if you look at the last letters of the titles of each of these leaders out of exile, the last letter of Mashiach is a Ches. This last letter of Moshe Rabbeinu is a Vav. The last letter of Ezra HaSofer is a Resh. The last letter of Mordechai is a Yud. And the last letter of Matisyahu Kohen is a Nun. And that spells out Chorin. As we say, next year we should be B'nai Chorin. Next year we should be free people. We should be experiencing the full gamut of freedom from all of the various types of exiles that we have endured as a people. And finally, as we move on from Ha Lachma Anya, and the next thing we get to is the Ma Nishtana, the questions by the 4 sons. So in his commentary, Agudos Ezov, he points out that the Mishnah in Maseches Psachim, when it brings in the Ma Nishtana, it starts off with the words, Mozgin lo kos sheni, that we pour the second cup of wine, Vikan, and at this point, Haben Shoel Me'aviv, the son is going to ask the questions to his father. So why does the Mishnah emphasize this connection of the son asking the questions with the pouring of the second cup of wine? So to explain this, remember I mentioned yesterday about his great creativity. He says there's a Gemara in Maseches Shabbos, which says that in future days, Hashem is going to say to Avram Avinu, Banecha chatuli, your sons sinned to me. And Avram's going to respond, wipe them out in order to sanctify your name. So then Hashem's going to go to Yaakov and tell him the same thing, your sons have sinned. And Yaakov's going to give the same answer, Hashem, wipe them out in order to sanctify your name. Then Hashem will come to Yitzchak. And when he comes to Yitzchak and says, your sons have sinned, Yitzchak will respond, Ribona Shalom, Banai v'lo banecha? Hashem, are they my sons and not your sons? So interestingly, we find that Yitzchak comes out to be the most merciful of the 3 avos, of the 3 patriarchs. And he continues by saying that we find by Avram Avinu, he gave everything he had to Yitzchak, and he sent Yishmael away. Yaakov didn't have any issues as far as any of his children leading the path that he was showing them. But Yitzchak, even though he had an Esav, someone who's not living up to the principles of his father, the pasuk tells us very clearly that Yitzchak loved Esav. And he wanted to show us that even a son whose behavior is inappropriate still needs to be considered to be a son and loved by his father. And that's why Yitzchak is the same Yitzchak who loved Esav is the one who was able to say to Hashem, when Hashem in the future will be angry with the Jewish people, V'chi banayhem v'lo banecha? Are they my sons and not your sons? As the Gemara quotes Rabbi Meir as saying that no matter what we do, we are always God's children. He says the 4 cups of wine correspond to Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and David. And therefore the 2nd cup of wine would correspond to Yitzchak. And that's why it's specifically Yitzchak, the one of the Avos, the one of the patriarchs, who understood that every child, no matter where he's holding, is a son. So we pour the cup that corresponds to Yitzchak, V'kan haben shoel mi aviv. That's the appropriate time for a son to pose the questions to his father, because no matter who the son is, the father is symbolized by Yitzchak, is ready to answer his questions. We will continue hopefully tomorrow evening.